Britain entered the Boer War expecting it to last months. The enemy was a scattering of sun-weathered farmers, stubborn Calvinist settlers who had spent generations scratching a living from the dry South African veldt. They had no professional army, no navy, no empire at their backs. Against the greatest military power on earth, they seemed to have no chance at all. And yet those farmers held the British Empire at bay for nearly 3 years, forcing London to deploy nearly 500,000 soldiers to subdue a population smaller than the city of Manchester. When Britain finally broke Boer resistance, it did so not on the battlefield but through methods that horrified the watching world: scorched farms, poisoned wells, and concentration camps where more than 20,000 women and children perished from disease and neglect. Britain won. Militarily, unambiguously, completely. But the cost of that victory was something no general could tally in a ledger. How does the self-proclaimed beacon of civilization justify burning a people's homes to ash and caging their families in wire enclosures on the open plain? In this documentary, we'll journey into the heart of that contradiction and trace how the Boer War cracked the moral foundation of the British Empire wide open. At the southern tip of a vast continent, where two great oceans collide in churning currents, lay a land of extraordinary contradiction. The South African interior stretched endlessly northward from dramatic coastal cliffs into rolling grasslands the locals called the veldt, vast open plains broken by flat-topped mountains and dry river courses that could flood without warning. This was a landscape of brutal beauty, baking under a fierce sun for months, then shivering through cold high-veld nights that surprised those who imagined all of Africa as perpetually tropical. For thousands of years before any European eye ever swept across this horizon, the land was alive with human presence. The Sand People, among the oldest cultures on Earth, moved across the veldt in small bands, their intimate knowledge of every plant and animal representing accumulated wisdom stretching back tens of thousands of years. The Khoikhoi herded cattle along seasonal routes. Further north and east, Bantu-speaking peoples, including the Zulu, the Xhosa, and the Sotho, had built sophisticated societies with complex political structures, cattle economies, and rich oral traditions. This was not empty land waiting for history to begin. History had been unfolding here for millennia. Then, in 1652, a Dutch surgeon named Jan van Riebeck planted a flag at the Cape of Good Hope on behalf of the Dutch East India Company. His brief was modest, merely to establish a refreshment station for ships rounding the Cape on their long journey to the spice markets of Asia. No one spoke of conquest. No one, at least, spoke of it openly. But settlement has its own momentum. Within decades, Dutch colonists were pushing inland, claiming land, clashing violently with Khoikhoi communities, and importing enslaved people from across the Dutch trading empire. The colony grew, and as it grew, something new began to emerge on the frontier. The descendants of these settlers, mixing Dutch, German, and French Huguenot heritage, developed their own language, a simplified Dutch that would eventually become Afrikaans. They called themselves Boers, simply the Dutch word for farmers, and they fashioned an identity bound tightly to the land, to Calvinist faith, and to a fierce, almost defiant independence. Moving ever deeper into the interior with their ox wagons, their Bibles, and their rifles, they saw themselves not as agents of empire, but as a chosen people in a promised land. The dispossession this expansion required, land seized, communities destroyed, people reduced to servitude, was not incidental to Boer frontier culture. It was foundational to it. By the 19th century, two very different visions of South Africa were beginning to take shape. One carried in the saddlebags of Boer trekkers and another arriving by steamship from London. The collision between them would consume the veldt in fire and forge one of the most contested moral episodes in British imperial history. The British arrived at the Cape Colony not by conquest but by paperwork. In 1806, following the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, the colonial administration changed hands almost administratively, the Dutch formally ceding their southern African foothold to the Crown. For London, it was a strategic acquisition, a way station on the route to India. For the Boers already farming its interior, it was the beginning of something intolerable. British administrators brought with them British ideas. English became the language of government and courts. British settlers arrived, competing for land and influence. And then, in 1833, the Emancipation Act abolished slavery throughout the empire. The Boers did not oppose this on economic grounds alone. For many, slavery was woven into their theological worldview, a natural order they believed sanctioned by Scripture. British compensation for freed enslaved people was deemed inadequate and, insultingly, could only be claimed in London. Many Boer farmers received nothing. This was the breaking point. Rather than submit to a government they viewed as godless and interfering, thousands of Boer families made a decision of staggering audacity. They would simply leave. Beginning in the mid-1830s and continuing into the 1840s, an estimated 14,000 men, women, and children loaded their ox wagons and moved north and east into the interior. They called it the Great Trek, and they would mythologize it for generations as their own exodus, their own crossing of the wilderness toward a promised homeland. The image of the great wagon train, wheels creaking over mountain passes and across swollen rivers, became the central icon of Boer identity. But the interior was not wilderness. It was occupied. The Zulu kingdom under their powerful leadership controlled vast territories in the east. The encounter between trekkers and Zulu warriors culminated in fierce violence, most bloodily at the Battle of Blood River in December of 1838, where a commando force of roughly 500 Boers fought off a Zulu attack of thousands from within a circle of wagons, killing over 3,000 Zulu warriors. The Boers lost not a single man. They declared it a miracle from God, binding the date into the calendar of their national faith. With African resistance broken or bypassed, the Boers planted their flags. The South African Republic, known as the Transvaal, was established in 1852. The Orange Free State followed 2 years later. Britain, weary of the cost of frontier wars, formally recognized both republics. The Boers had achieved something remarkable, their own sovereign nations, built by sheer will and wagon wheel, governed by their own laws, in their own language, under their own God. What London failed to notice, or chose not to notice, was what lay beneath this hard-won soil. The answer would come glittering out of the earth in the decades ahead, and it would change everything. For a time, the two Boer republics sat at the edge of British consciousness, distant, inconvenient, largely ignored. London had recognized their independence and was content, for the moment, to leave them to their dry pastures and their Calvinist certainties. Then the earth gave up its secrets, and the world came running. In 1867, a farmer's son named Erasmus Jacobs picked up a glittering stone on the banks of the Orange River near Kimberley. He did not know what he held. A traveling trader named Schalk van Niekerk did. The stone was a diamond of over 21 carats, and its discovery ignited one of the great mineral rushes of the 19th century. Within 5 years, Tens of thousands of prospectors, speculators, and adventurers had descended on the Northern Cape, tearing the earth apart with picks and bare hands. By the early 1880s, Kimberley was producing the vast majority of the world's diamonds, and the dry scrubland that had meant nothing to imperial planners had become the most intensely coveted ground in southern Africa. But diamonds were only the opening act. In 1886, a prospector named George Harrison stumbled upon the main reef of the Witwatersrand, a ridge of gold-bearing rock running beneath the Transvaal Plateau. What Harrison had found was not a pocket of ore. It was the largest gold deposit ever discovered on Earth. The Boer Republic that Britain had dismissed as a pastoral backwater suddenly sat atop a fortune that would rewrite the balance of global finance. Into this transformed landscape walked Cecil John Rhodes, a young Englishman of ferocious ambition who had arrived in southern Africa for his health and stayed for everything else. With a genius for manipulation and finance that unsettled even his admirers, Rhodes consolidated the diamond fields under a single company, De Beers, and acquired a personal fortune that made him effectively a private imperial power. His vision was explicit and unapologetic. A British corridor of territory stretching without interruption from Cape Town to Cairo, a spine of empire running the full length of the continent. The Boer Republic sat directly in its path. Rhodes was not alone. A new class of mining magnates, known dismissively by the Boers as the Randlords, had built empires of finance on Witwatersrand gold. Men like Alfred Beat and Barney Barnato accumulated capital and political influence in equal measure, and they shared Rhodes's frustration with the Transvaal government of Paul Kruger, an old-fashioned, stubborn Boer patriarch who viewed the miners flooding his republic with profound suspicion. Those miners were the Uitlanders, the foreigners. By the early 1890s, they likely outnumbered the Boer population of the Transvaal itself, drawn by gold, building cities almost overnight in the veld. Johannesburg, barely a decade old, had the bones of a metropolis. And yet Kruger refused to extend these newcomers political rights, fearing they would simply vote his republic out of existence. In London, the strategic anxiety was becoming acute. A wealthy, independent Transvaal with German diplomatic flirtations and a restive foreign population sitting on the world's gold supply was not a peripheral concern. It was a threat to the entire architecture of British Southern Africa. The ingredients were assembled. Grievance, greed, imperial ambition, and Boer defiance had been simmering for years. What was needed was a spark, and one was already being lit recklessly behind closed doors by men who believed they could settle the matter quickly and cleanly before the world was watching. Cecil Rhodes had never been a man for half measures. By the mid-1890s, he held simultaneously the position of Prime Minister of the Cape Colony and Managing Director of the British South Africa Company, a combination of political and corporate power with no real precedent in the empire's history. He controlled territory. He controlled capital. He controlled, or believed he controlled, men. What he could not control was Paul Kruger, and that failure consumed him. The plan Rhodes devised with his confederate, Leander Starr Jameson, was audacious to the point of delusion. Uitlander agitators inside Johannesburg would rise against Kruger's government, and Jameson would ride in from Bechuanaland with a column of armed company police to support them, installing a friendly regime before anyone in London or Cape Town could raise an objection. It was the kind of scheme that only makes sense to men who have succeeded too often and been corrected too rarely. Jameson launched his raid on the 29th of December, 1895, with roughly 500 men. The Uitlander uprising failed to materialize. The Boers, who had received intelligence warnings, were waiting. Within days, Jameson's column was surrounded near Doornkop and forced into an embarrassing surrender. The men were handed over to British authorities. Rhodes resigned as Cape Prime Minister in disgrace. The scheme that was supposed to resolve the Transvaal question quietly had instead illuminated it for the entire watching world. The international response was swift and damaging. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany dispatched a personal telegram to Paul Kruger on the 3rd of January, 1896, congratulating him on repelling the raiders without calling on the assistance of friendly powers. The Kruger telegram, as it became known, was an act of deliberate provocation toward Britain, and it worked perfectly. British newspapers erupted in fury at German interference. But beneath the anger lay an uncomfortable truth. The raid had exposed British imperial ambition in its rawest, most lawless form, and foreign powers were paying very close attention. For the Boers, the failed raid carried a different lesson. They had been right not to trust British intentions, and they would not be caught unprepared again. Through the late 1890s, Kruger's government spent the Transvaal's gold revenues on a systematic program of military modernization. Thousands of German Mauser rifles arrived, along with French and German artillery pieces of the latest design. Boer commandos, already skilled horsemen and marksmen from generations of frontier life, were being equipped with weapons that would eventually shock British professional soldiers accustomed to colonial opponents armed with spears and muskets. In London, the new colonial secretary Joseph Chamberlain pressed forward with a harder line. Maneuvering alongside the High Commissioner for South Africa, Alfred Milner, a cold-eyed administrator who believed that only a fundamental restructuring of the Transvaal's political arrangements would secure British supremacy. Diplomacy continued in conference rooms in Bloemfontein and in dispatches between Pretoria and London, but the Jameson Raid had poisoned the well beyond recovery. Every British assurance now sounded to Boer ears like a prelude to the next deception. By the autumn of 1899, both sides had convinced themselves that war was inevitable, and each had reasons to believe that moving quickly served their interests. Kruger issued an ultimatum on the 9th of October demanding Britain withdraw its troops from Transvaal borders within 48 hours. London refused to dignify it with compliance. On the 11th of October, 1899, the Boer republics and the British Empire went to war. What followed would confound every expectation on both sides and produce costs, moral as well as human, that would echo far beyond the South African veld. Alfred Milner arrived in Cape Town in May of 1897 carrying few illusions and considerable ambition. He was 43 years old, Oxford educated, a former journalist turned colonial administrator with an analytical mind that some found brilliant and others found frightening. Where Cecil Rhodes had pursued imperial dominance through commercial cunning and personal charisma, Milner pursued it through paperwork, policy, and an unshakable conviction that British supremacy in South Africa was not merely desirable, but historically inevitable. He was, in his own estimation, simply accelerating what was going to happen anyway. The instrument Milner chose was the Uitlander grievance. Hundreds of thousands of foreign workers, predominantly British, had flooded the Transvaal's mining districts, and Kruger's government taxed them heavily while denying them the vote. It was a genuine injustice, and Milner understood its propaganda value completely. Here was a wrong that required British intervention, a humanitarian cause that would make expansion look like rescue. The two men met face-to-face in Bloemfontein in late May and early June of 1899. The conference was, from its first sessions, a study in mutual incomprehension. Kruger, then 73 years old, had spent his entire life watching British promises dissolve at the moment they became inconvenient. He offered concessions on the franchise question, carefully staged to appear generous while preserving the Republic's fundamental independence. Milner found every offer inadequate. He had instructions from Colonial Secretary Chamberlain to press hard, and he pressed. After 9 days, the conference collapsed without agreement. Milner had already laid his deeper strategy on the table in a private dispatch to Chamberlain in May, before the two men had even met. In language that officials tried and failed to keep from public circulation, he described the Uitlanders as the subjects of a great empire reduced to the status of helots. The Helot Dispatch, as it became known, did exactly what Milner intended. It reframed a diplomatic dispute as a moral emergency. British newspapers received the message and amplified it. Public opinion, already inflamed by memories of the Jameson humiliation, began moving toward the conclusion that Milner needed it to reach. What the newspapers did not fully examine was how deliberately the crisis had been engineered. Milner was not reacting to events, he was constructing them. He understood that Kruger, if given genuine time and genuine reassurance, might produce compromises that would give the Uitlanders political rights without giving Britain political control. That outcome was precisely what Milner wished to prevent. A negotiated settlement served nobody who wanted war. Through the summer of 1899, the temperature rose steadily. British troops began concentrating near Transvaal borders, reinforcements sailing from India and the home islands. Kruger watched the buildup with the fatalism of a man who has stopped expecting good faith from his neighbors. His generals advised him that if war was coming, the Boers needed to strike before British numbers became overwhelming. On the 9th of October, 1899, Kruger issued his ultimatum. Britain was to halt all military reinforcements, withdraw troops already massed near the frontier, and submit existing disputes to arbitration. The deadline was 48 hours. London read the document and felt something that may have resembled relief. Here, at last, was an act that required no justification, no manufactured outrage. The Boers had made themselves the aggressor, at least in the language of international opinion. 2 days later, on the 11th of October, the guns that everyone had been loading for years were finally permitted to speak. The British public expected it to be brief. Politicians spoke of a matter of weeks, of Christmas at home, of an enemy that would dissolve before professional soldiers. They were about to discover that Paul Kruger's military preparations, financed by Witwatersrand Rand gold and quietly assembled across 3 years of careful anticipation, had produced something the Empire had not recently encountered on any field. Not a rabble. An army. And on the open veld of South Africa, that army was waiting. They came across the border with a confidence that startled even those who had expected resistance. Within days of Kruger's ultimatum expiring, Boer commandos were pouring into British territory on 2 fronts simultaneously. In Natal to the east, General Piet Joubert led roughly 21,000 men south through the mountain passes. In the west, forces swept into Cape Colony itself, the crown jewel of British South Africa. This was not the defensive posture London had anticipated. The Boers intended to win the war before British reinforcements could arrive. By the end of October, the consequences of that boldness were becoming brutally clear. 3 British garrisons, the towns of Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking, found themselves encircled. Ladysmith held 12,000 troops under General George White, who had managed the considerable achievement of losing 2 separate engagements within a single week before retreating behind its walls. Kimberley trapped Cecil Rhodes himself, which at least gave the newspapers something dramatic to write about. Mafeking, defended by the resourceful Colonel Robert Baden-Powell with a garrison of little more than 1,000 men, began what would become a 217-day siege that captured the imagination of the entire empire. But sieges, however gripping, were not battles. Britain needed victories, and victories required relief columns. And so London sent its generals south, and the generals marched confidently toward the most catastrophic 7 days in recent imperial memory. They called it Black Week. It began on the 10th of December, 1899, and before it ended on the 15th, the British Army had suffered 3 defeats, so complete and so humiliating that the reverberations would be felt in drawing rooms, parliament, and foreign chancelleries alike. First came Stormberg in the Northern Cape. General William Gattaker led nearly 3,000 men on a night march toward a Boer position, relying on guides who led the column badly astray. When dawn broke, British soldiers found themselves beneath the very kopjes they were supposed to have outflanked. The Boers, firing from the high ground with devastating accuracy, killed and wounded over 90 men and captured another 633. Gattaker escaped with the remainder, leaving his prisoners behind in the dust. 2 days later, at Magersfontein near Kimberley, the disaster deepened. General Lord Methuen had been advancing to relieve the besieged town and believed artillery bombardment had softened the Boer defensive line on the ridge ahead. What his guns had not found was that General Couz de la Rey had ordered his men to dig trenches at the base of the hill rather than its crest, reversing every assumption British military doctrine carried about how defenders behaved. The Highland Brigade marched forward in the pre-dawn darkness, in close formation, straight into a wall of concentrated rifle fire at near point-blank range. Within minutes, nearly 900 men were dead or wounded. The survivors lay pinned in the open through the full heat of a South African summer day, unable to advance, reluctant to retreat, baking beneath a sky that offered nothing. Then came Colenso on the Tugela River in Natal, where General Redvers Buller led over 20,000 men against a Boer position held by barely 6,000 under Louis Botha. The attack collapsed in confusion. 2 artillery batteries, advancing too far forward without adequate infantry support, were captured. Over 1,100 British soldiers fell as casualties. Buller, surveying the wreckage, sent Whitehall a telegram suggesting that Ladysmith might need to surrender. The telegram caused something close to panic in London. 3 battles. 3 defeats. Nearly 2,400 casualties in 5 days. The largest empire in human history, commanding the greatest navy on earth and the confidence of a century of unbroken expansion, had been handed its worst military humiliation since the Crimea. What had gone wrong? The answer, plainly visible to anyone willing to examine it, was that the British Army had marched into battle expecting one kind of enemy and encountered another entirely. The Boers did not stand and volley. They did not wear bright uniforms or follow recognizable patterns of engagement. They simply aimed. And in the clear air of the High Veld, the telegram from Buller landed in London like a stone through glass. Within hours, the government had made its decision. Buller would be relieved of overall command, replaced by a man whose reputation stood as the empire's most reliable in crisis. Field Marshal Frederick Sly Roberts, known to the army simply as Bobs, a small, precise, 67-year-old veteran of the Indian Mutiny and the Afghan Wars. At his side would come a man of altogether colder temperament, General Horatio Herbert Kitchener, fresh from his methodical conquest of Sudan. Where Roberts inspired loyalty, Kitchener inspired something closer to fear. Together, they were exactly what the moment demanded. The appointment came at a price that no man should pay. Roberts received notice of his new command on the same day he learned that his only son, Lieutenant Frederick Roberts, had been mortally wounded at Colenso, shot while trying to save the abandoned artillery batteries that Buller's assault had left exposed. The young man died the following day, the 14th of December, 1899. Roberts buried his grief, accepted the command, and sailed for South Africa within the week. His son would receive the Victoria Cross posthumously. His father would not speak publicly of the loss. Some things the documentary record preserves only in silence. What Roberts brought with him, beyond experience and sorrow, was scale. Britain mobilized forces the Boer republics could scarcely have imagined when Kruger issued his ultimatum. By early 1900, more than 180,000 imperial troops were either in South Africa or crossing the Atlantic toward it, drawn from across the empire. Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and soldiers from India poured into Cape Town harbor. The docks groaned with horses, field guns, medical supplies, and ammunition. The empire was flexing muscles it had rarely needed to use so completely. Roberts moved with unexpected speed. Rather than repeat the frontal assaults that had broken his predecessors, he swung a massive column far to the west, striking at the logistical heart of the Boer position. In mid-February, this flanking movement delivered the war's most dramatic single moment, the relief of Kimberley, where Cecil Rhodes had spent nearly 4 months making himself thoroughly insufferable to the garrison commander. The town was free. The siege was broken. But the greater prize came immediately after. Retreating Boer forces under General Piet Cronje were caught at Paardeberg Drift on the Modder River, their supply wagons mired in the riverbank. For 10 days, British forces surrounded approximately 4,000 men. Kitchener ordered a frontal assault on the 18th of February that cost over 1,300 casualties in a single day, one of the bloodiest of the entire war. Roberts, arriving and overruling further direct attacks, chose encirclement instead. By the 27th of February, the anniversary of the Boer victory at Majuba Hill 19 years earlier, Cronje surrendered. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Bloemfontein, capital of the Orange Free State, fell on the 13th of March 1900. Roberts rode in at the head of his column to scenes of apparent celebration. Pretoria, capital of the Transvaal itself, would fall within months. To the watching world, the war appeared to be ending in the way wars against small adversaries were supposed to end, with overwhelming force, professional generalship, and the inevitable triumph of the empire. Appearances, as South Africa was still preparing to demonstrate, could be deeply misleading. The conventional war was won. But scattered across the High Veld and the distant Kopjes, Boer commanders were already drawing very different conclusions about what kind of war they intended to fight next. Johannesburg fell first. On the 31st of May, 1900, British columns entered the great mining city without a battle worth the name. The gold reef that had sparked the entire crisis, the impossible wealth beneath the Witwatersrand, passed into imperial hands almost quietly. Mine owners who had complained so bitterly about Kruger's government now watched British soldiers march past their counting houses. The prize that had obsessed Cape Town financiers and London speculators for years was secured. Roberts telegraphed the news home with the measured satisfaction of a man who believes the hardest work is done. Then came Pretoria. On the 5th of June, 1900, Field Marshal Roberts rode into the Transvaal capital at the head of his army. The Vierkleur, the four-colored flag of the Republic, was hauled down from the government buildings. The Union Jack rose in its place. British soldiers who had marched hundreds of miles in brutal heat, who had watched comrades fall at Colenso and Paardeberg and a dozen engagements in between, stood at attention in the main square and allowed themselves to feel that it was over. London agreed with them. The relief that poured through the streets of British cities was unrestrained. Church bells rang. Newspapers printed their largest typefaces. The Boers had been beaten, the republics humbled, the honor of the empire restored after the long humiliation of Black Week the previous December. Roberts was the hero of the hour, the quiet professional who had done what the empire required of him. Paul Kruger, the old president who had defied Britain so stubbornly and for so long, was nowhere to be found. He had already gone, traveling east by rail as the British columns closed in, carrying with him the gold reserves of the Transvaal and, more importantly, the legitimacy of a government in exile. He would eventually reach Portuguese East Africa, then board a Dutch warship bound for Europe. He would never return to Africa. He died in Switzerland in 1904, having watched from a distance everything that followed. Whether he died in despair or in grim satisfaction is a question history cannot quite answer. Roberts moved swiftly to formalize what his army had accomplished. The Orange Free State had already been renamed the Orange River Colony and annexed to the British Crown. Now he did the same to the Transvaal. On the 1st of September 1900, the republic that Kruger had spent decades building ceased to exist as a sovereign nation. Roberts announced that the war was effectively over. Remaining resistance, he suggested, would dissolve within weeks as Boer fighters recognized the futility of further struggle. He was mistaken in a way that would cost Britain dearly. What Roberts could not see clearly from Pretoria, what London could not see at all from its celebrations, was the gathering of purpose among men who had not surrendered and had no intention of doing so. Generals like Louis Botha, Couz de la Rey, and Christian de Wet were not demoralized. They were recalculating. The conventional war, the one fought with massed formations and defended capitals, was lost. But South Africa's vast interior offered something else entirely: space, mobility, and a civilian population whose farms and families were woven through the landscape the British now claimed to control. The flags had been changed. The proclamations had been signed. And somewhere out on the open veld, beyond the reach of Roberts's satisfied telegrams, a very different war was quietly beginning. They had no capital left to defend. No treasury, no presidential palace, no formal army in any conventional sense. What the Boer commanders had instead was something far more dangerous to an occupying power: intimate knowledge of the land, the loyalty of scattered farming communities, and an absolute refusal to accept the verdict that Roberts had announced from Pretoria. The decision to fight on as commandos was not taken lightly. These were farmers and tradesmen, men with wives and children on homesteads spread across hundreds of miles of veld. Surrender would have meant safety of a kind. Continued resistance meant years more of hardship, separation, and death. Yet the vote among the remaining Boer leadership was decisive. They would fight on. 3 men above all would shape what followed. Louis Botha, barely 38 years old in 1900, possessed a quality rare among military commanders. He could hold men together under pressure that fractured lesser leaders. Calm, politically shrewd, capable of inspiring loyalty without demanding it, Botha would prove himself not merely a guerrilla fighter, but a strategist who understood that this war would eventually be decided by endurance rather than battlefield brilliance. Christian de Wet was something else entirely. Restless, ferocious, almost contemptuous of caution, De Wet turned the British supply lines into his personal hunting ground. He struck ammunition convoys, dynamited railway bridges, disappeared into the landscape before pursuing columns could find him. The British would chase De Wet across the Orange River colony for 2 years without catching him. He became, in their newspapers, a figure approaching legend, which was precisely the problem. Every failed British pursuit of De Wet was a public humiliation broadcast across the empire. Coups de la Rey operated in the Western Transvaal with similar effectiveness but different methods. Methodical where De Wet was mercurial. De la Rey understood the mechanics of ambush with an almost scientific precision. His strikes against British columns in the rocky hills of the Magaliesberg region demonstrated that the conventional war's end had changed nothing about the fundamental difficulty of the terrain. What made the guerrilla campaign so maddening for British commanders was its scale. South Africa was vast beyond the comprehension of officers trained on European battlefields. The two former republics together covered an area larger than France and Germany combined. British forces controlled the towns, the main railway lines, the administrative centers. Beyond those corridors of occupation stretched an ocean of open country where small Boer units could vanish completely. A commando of 50 men could strike, scatter, and reassemble 50 miles away before British mounted infantry finished writing their casualty reports. Supply lines became a particular obsession on both sides. The British Army required enormous quantities of food, ammunition, and fodder for its horses, all moving by rail across a network that De Wet and others targeted with systematic enthusiasm. A dynamited bridge might halt supplies to an entire sector for days. The psychological effect compounded the logistical one. British soldiers found themselves guarding every culvert, every water tank, every isolated station, stretched impossibly thin across a landscape that seemed to swallow their strength. By October of 1900, Roberts could no longer maintain the fiction that organized resistance was dissolving. The cables to London grew less confident. The weeks he had promised stretched into months with no sign of the final Boer collapse. And Roberts himself was exhausted, aging, and increasingly aware that the war he had been sent to finish had transformed into something he had not been prepared to fight. On the 29th of November, 1900, Lord Roberts handed command of British forces in South Africa to General Horatio Herbert Kitchener and sailed for home. He left to a hero's welcome in London, elevated to an earldom for his victories. He also left behind an army of nearly 250,000 men who were losing, by every honest measure, to an enemy that no longer possessed a single city or a square mile of formally governed territory. Kitchener looked out at the veld and began to think very differently about how this war would have to be won. The methods he would reach for would prove far more consequential than any battle yet fought. Horatio Herbert Kitchener was not a man who entertained sentiment about war. Those who worked alongside him described a quality in his blue eyes that unsettled even senior officers, a coldness that seemed less like cruelty than complete indifference to anything that slowed results. He had built his reputation in Sudan, where his methodical destruction of the Mahdist forces at Omdurman in 1898 had demonstrated his core belief. Overwhelming, systematic force, applied without hesitation, ended wars faster than any amount of careful negotiation. He arrived in South Africa carrying that conviction like a tool he already knew how to use. The problem he inherited was, at its heart, a problem of geography and information. Boer commandos moved freely because the veldt offered them invisibility. They vanished into farmsteads that fed them, sheltered them, and reported British movements with quiet efficiency. Kitchener understood almost immediately that killing individual guerrillas was beside the point. The support network itself had to be dismantled. His first great engineering project was the blockhouse system. Beginning in earnest through 1901, Kitchener ordered the construction of thousands of small fortified posts across the veldt, connected by barbed wire fencing that divided the landscape into compartments. At its eventual extent, the network stretched across nearly 8,000 miles of South African terrain. Small garrisons, sometimes as few as 6 men, occupied each post, watching their section of wire, signaling movement by heliograph. The system transformed the open country into something resembling a vast slow net. Then came the drives. Kitchener organized his columns into extended lines, sometimes stretching 20 or 30 miles across the veldt, sweeping forward in coordination to push Boer commandos against the wire barriers. The logistics required were extraordinary, demanding the kind of precise scheduling that appealed to Kitchener's administrative instincts. Thousands of mounted troops and infantrymen moved in coordinated arcs, communicating by signal, tightening the perimeter around areas where commandos had been reported. The results were deeply frustrating. De Wet slipped through. De la Rey evaded. Botha's forces scattered before the advancing lines and reassembled elsewhere. The Boers had spent their entire lives reading this landscape. They found gaps that British maps did not show, dry watercourses that offered concealed movement, rocky ridges that broke the geometric tidiness of Kitchener's calculations. Drive after drive swept the veldt and captured handfuls of exhausted fighters while the main commando leaders rode free. The frustration was measurable in Kitchener's cables to London. He had promised efficiency. He was delivering an expensive, grinding stalemate that consumed horses at catastrophic rates and wore his men down without producing the decisive collapse he had expected. The Boers were still out there. The war was already into its second year with no end visible. And so Kitchener began reaching further. If the commandos survived because the farming communities fed and sheltered them, then those communities had to be removed from the equation entirely. Livestock was seized or destroyed. Crops were burned. Farmsteads that had supplied guerrilla units were put to the torch. The policy spread across the former republics with the mechanical consistency that characterized everything Kitchener ordered. It was brutal logic, the logic of a man who believed that sufficient pressure applied systematically to every supporting element of an enemy's resistance would eventually produce surrender. Whether he was right would become one of history's more contested questions. What was undeniable was where this logic led next, to a question that would have no clean answer and no comfortable legacy. If the women and children driven from those burning farms could not remain on the veldt, where exactly were they supposed to go? The order came down through official channels in the spring of 1901, formalized in language that bureaucratized what was already happening in practice. Scorched earth. The phrase had the clean neutrality of military doctrine, stripped of any suggestion of what it actually meant when translated into the daily life of the South African veldt. What it meant was fire. British columns moved across the former Boer republics with systematic purpose, working through districts the way a farmer works through fields at harvest time, methodically, completely. A farmstead would appear on the horizon, white walls catching the morning light, the smell of wood smoke from a kitchen already lit. Within hours, it would be a ruin. Thatched roofs caught fast. Furniture dragged into yards fed the flames. Photographs, Bibles, the small accumulated objects of family life, all of it fed the same indifferent heat. By the war's end, more than 30,000 homesteads had been destroyed across the Transvaal and Orange Free State. The livestock followed. Cattle that could feed a commando unit or carry supplies for a resupply run were shot where they stood or driven off and slaughtered beyond recovery. Sheep, horses, pigs, the working animals that made agricultural life possible on the veldt, were killed in numbers that stripped the land of its productive capacity entirely. Grain stores were burned. Fruit orchards were cut down. Wells were contaminated, rendered useless to anyone who came after. The calculation behind all of this was straightforward enough. In the cold arithmetic of counterinsurgency, a commando unit without food could not fight. A guerrilla force without shelter would break against the first winter cold. Kitchener's staff had identified the Boer farming communities as the logistical backbone of the resistance, and they were not wrong. The farms fed the fighters, clothed them, reported British movements, and gave exhausted men a place to sleep and recover. Remove the farms, and the commandos would have nowhere left to turn. But farms are not simply military assets. They are homes, and they contain families. As column after column swept through the countryside, burning and breaking, the women and children who had been managing those homesteads alone found themselves standing in the open veldt with whatever they had been allowed to carry. Husbands and fathers were out fighting or already captured. The land that had sustained their families, in some cases for generations, was ash behind them. Tens of thousands of displaced people, almost all of them women, children, and elderly men, were now scattered across a landscape that had been deliberately rendered unable to support them. The displacement was not accidental. It was the policy's inevitable consequence, and British commanders knew it. If the goal was to strip the veldt of everything that could sustain a fighting man, that logic applied to the civilians who would otherwise remain on the land, growing new crops, rebuilding, continuing to provide what assistance they could. And so they were collected, loaded onto carts and wagons, sometimes given hours to gather belongings, sometimes less, and moved toward the railway lines that connected British-held towns. The Boer rural world, built over generations by families who had trekked away from British authority precisely to build something of their own, was being systematically erased. Field by field, farm by farm, family by family. What happened to the people gathered at those railway lines, where they were taken and what awaited them there, would become the chapter of this war that no amount of military victory could ever quite explain away. They called them refugee camps at first. The word refugee carried a suggestion of charity, of shelter offered to the vulnerable. But there was nothing voluntary about what greeted the women and children loaded onto those railway wagons. They were not refugees seeking safety. They were prisoners who had not yet been told what they were. The first camps were established in the final months of 1900, initially as improvised holding areas near the main railway junctions of the Transvaal and Orange Free State. Bloemfontein, Pretoria, Johannesburg. The British military administrators who set them up were working without precedent, without adequate planning, and without any serious reckoning with what it would mean to house tens of thousands of people on the open veldt with military-issue rations and canvas tents. By the middle of 1901, more than 100,000 Boer civilians were living, or attempting to live, inside these enclosures. The tents were designed for soldiers in the field, not for families, not for infants, not for winter. When the temperatures dropped on the high veldt, they dropped hard. When the rains came, the ground between tent rows turned to mud that carried everything with it, including whatever passed through a camp of thousands without adequate latrines. What passed through was disease, and it moved with terrifying speed. Measles arrived first. In the Boer farming communities, Children had grown up scattered across enormous distances, isolated enough that they had never built immunity to the common infections that swept through crowded urban populations. In the camps, that isolation ended overnight. A child who had never encountered measles found herself sharing a tent with 20 others. The virus needed no invitation. Measles alone killed thousands, but it was what came after that compounded the catastrophe. Children weakened by measles could not fight off the secondary infections that followed, and in the camps, the secondary infections were always waiting. Typhoid moved through the water. Dysentery moved through everything. The medical facilities were inadequate from the beginning and overwhelmed almost immediately. Doctors were few. Medicines were scarce. The nurses who eventually arrived, many of them volunteers, kept meticulous records of what they found, records that would later become damning evidence against the system itself. The food was the other instrument of slow death. The official ration scale provided to Boer civilians was already insufficient. For families of men still out fighting on commando, the rations were reduced further, a deliberate policy decision made somewhere in the military hierarchy that treated hunger as a tool of pressure. Children do not understand such distinctions. They only understand hunger. By the middle of 1901, the monthly death rate in some camps had climbed to levels that, expressed as an annual figure, would have killed the entire camp population inside a year. The camp at Mafeking reported death rates that shocked even some of the British officers who encountered them. The camp at Bloemfontein was burying children by the dozen each week. Who was counting? That question matters. Emily Hobhouse, a British welfare activist who had traveled to South Africa at her own initiative, entered the camps in early 1901 and came back with something the military authorities had not anticipated: numbers, names, and a fury that could not be managed or dismissed. Her report, submitted to the British government in the spring of that year, described scenes of suffering so systematic that negligence shaded into something darker. When the final accounting was eventually made, the figures were staggering. More than 27,000 Boer civilians died in the camps. Approximately 20,000 of them were children. 20,000 children in canvas tents on the South African veldt under a British flag. The military logic of the Scorched Earth campaign had brought these families to the camps. But it was the camps themselves, the overcrowding, the contaminated water, the reduced rations, the absent medicine, that transformed displacement into mass death. And the question being asked in London increasingly and with rising anger was whether anyone in authority had noticed, and if they had noticed, whether they had cared. That question was about to find its voice. The Boer women and children in the camps had names. Their deaths were counted eventually. They became a cause, a scandal, a stain on the conscience of an empire. But there was another population caught in this war, a far larger one, and for most of the century that followed, history would barely pause to acknowledge them at all. Black Africans did not start this war. It was not their dispute. The conflict between British imperial ambition and Boer Republican independence concerned the future governance of a land that both white communities claimed as their own, with almost no consideration for the people who had lived there longest. And yet Black Africans, numbering in the hundreds of thousands across the Transvaal and Orange Free State, found themselves pulled into the machinery of the conflict whether they chose to be or not. The British pressed Black Africans into service as laborers, scouts, and auxiliaries. Some served willingly, calculating that a British victory might bring better conditions than life under Boer rule, where movement was restricted, rights were non-existent, and violence from white farmers was a daily risk. Others had no meaningful choice. The army needed people to dig, to carry, to guide, and to watch. Black men were available, and the British used them. The Boers understood this, and they punished it. Communities suspected of aiding British forces, of passing information, of harboring scouts, faced violent reprisals. Farms were burned, livestock seized, and men killed. The same scorched earth logic applied to Boer homesteads was applied here with less restraint and fewer witnesses. And then there were the camps. Separate from the Boer camps, less documented, and even more neglected, the British established enclosures for Black African civilians displaced by the war. At their peak, these camps held more than 100,000 people. The conditions inside them were, by almost every measure, worse than what the Boer camps offered. Rations were thinner. Medical attention was more scarce. Oversight was minimal. The suffering was vast. How many died? The honest answer is that no one knows with precision, because no one in authority tried very hard to find out. Contemporary estimates, drawn from incomplete records and later historical research, suggest that more than 20,000 Black Africans perished in these camps. Some historians argue the true figure was considerably higher. Unlike the Boer camps, where reformers like Emily Hobhouse documented the deaths in detail and carried the evidence back to Parliament, the Black African camps attracted almost no equivalent advocacy. No one came with a notebook. No one submitted a report that reached the floor of the House of Commons. That silence was not accidental. The entire framework of the war's public debate in Britain was built around the suffering of white Boer civilians. The political argument was conducted in those terms. The moral outrage was calibrated to those deaths. Black African deaths did not fit the narrative that either side was constructing, and so they were set aside, unrecorded, unmourned by those with the power to memorialize. This was the deeper wound. Not just the deaths, but the erasure that followed them. The war would eventually produce its official histories, its memorials, its commemorations. The names carved into stone were, with vanishingly few exceptions, white names. The story told about what the concentration camps meant was, for generations, a story told about Boer suffering and British shame. The other suffering, larger in some measures, simply did not register. What does it mean to win a war while erasing the people most trapped within it? That question would take most of a century even to be asked seriously, and the asking of it changed everything about how the conflict could be understood. But in 1901, the war was not yet over. And in London, the arguments about how to fight it were about to crack the political landscape open. She was not a soldier, a politician, or a journalist. She was the 40-year-old daughter of an archdeacon from Cornwall, and she arrived in Cape Town in late 1900 carrying a letter of introduction and a growing sense of dread. Emily Hobhouse had come to see for herself what the British military was doing in the name of empire. What she found in the Bloemfontein camp would not leave her for the rest of her life. The camp held thousands of Boer women and children in rows of canvas tents that offered almost no protection against the scorching summer heat. The ground was dust in dry weather and mud after rain. Children arrived already weakened by months of displacement, their immune systems offering little resistance to the measles, dysentery, and typhoid that moved through the crowded enclosures with terrible efficiency. Hobhouse moved between the tents with a notebook, recording names, ages, and circumstances. A child of 7 dying of measles. A mother who had buried 3 children in 6 weeks. Rations calculated to sustain life, but not to restore it. She wrote everything down. When she returned to Britain in the spring of 1901, she brought her notes to the South African Women and Children Distress Fund, and then to anyone in Parliament who would listen. In June of that year, her report was published. It ran to dozens of pages of detailed testimony. It named the camps not as regrettable military necessities, but as engines of preventable death. The mortality rate in some camps, she calculated, had reached levels that, if sustained across the full population of England, would kill nearly 3,000 people every day. The establishment did not respond with gratitude. War Secretary St. John Broderick dismissed her findings as exaggerated, sentimental, and unpatriotic. The popular press, stoked by the jingoism that had carried the war forward for 2 years, branded Hobhouse a traitor. She was accused of giving comfort to the enemy, of undermining the troops, of manufacturing suffering for political purposes. One newspaper called her the screech owl of Exeter Hall. The message from official Britain was clear. The appropriate response to a war was loyalty, not questions. But the questions could not be silenced. Her report reached the Liberal opposition in Parliament, where Henry Campbell Bannerman, the party leader, delivered a speech in June 1901 asking what phrase was appropriate for a system of camps where children were dying in such numbers. His answer? Methods of barbarism, detonated across the political landscape. The government was furious. A portion of the public was beginning to wonder. Hobhouse attempted to return to South Africa in October of that year to continue her work. The military was waiting for her. She was detained aboard her ship in Cape Town Harbor, prevented from disembarking, and sent back to Britain under what amounted to armed escort. The woman who had documented the camps was now officially banned from seeing them. The government would eventually commission its own investigation, the Fawcett Commission, led by Millicent Fawcett. That inquiry confirmed much of what Hobhouse had reported, leading to reforms that gradually reduced the death rates. But the political damage was done. Britain had been seen, by itself and by the watching world, doing something that required covering up. Emily Hobhouse had forced a mirror in front of the Empire, and the Empire had not liked what it saw. She would spend years afterward working to establish practical relief for the very communities the war had destroyed. Her confrontation with the British government raised a question that would echo forward through the remainder of the conflict. If the camps were now reformed and the death rates falling, had Britain actually addressed the problem or merely managed the scandal? The answer to that question lay in what came next. Campbell Bannerman's phrase had been a match dropped into dry timber. Methods of barbarism did not merely describe the camps. It accused. And in accusing, it forced every member of British society to decide where they stood. The division ran through families, newspapers, churches, and dinner tables. On one side stood the imperialists, those who believed that British expansion was not merely profitable but civilizing, that the Boer republics had to be brought inside the empire for their own eventual good, and that any suffering along the way was the unavoidable arithmetic of progress. On the other side gathered a coalition that surprised itself with its own passion. Radicals, nonconformists, trade unionists, and liberals who argued that what Britain was doing in South Africa had corroded something essential in the national character. The pro-Boer movement, as it was derisively labeled by its opponents, attracted figures of genuine moral courage. It also attracted genuine danger. When David Lloyd George, then a rising Welsh Liberal MP, agreed to speak at a public meeting in Birmingham in December 1900, he walked into something close to a riot. Birmingham was Joseph Chamberlain's city, and Chamberlain was the war's most powerful civilian champion. A crowd of several thousand gathered outside the town hall, many of them armed with whatever came to hand. Windows shattered. Police struggled to hold the doors. Lloyd George, who had been speaking against the war with increasing ferocity, was smuggled out of the building dressed in a policeman's uniform. 2 people died in the violence that night. The message was unmistakable. Dissent carried a physical price. The press war was no less fierce. The dominant newspapers, led by the outlets that had celebrated British victories with banner headlines and patriotic verse, treated critics of the war as traitors. Against them stood a smaller but formidable dissenting press, UT. Stead, one of the most celebrated journalists of his generation, published a pamphlet called Methods of Barbarism that sold hundreds of thousands of copies and landed him in a social exile from which his career never fully recovered. He had made his name exposing injustice at home. Now he turned that same unflinching attention on what Britain was doing abroad, and a significant portion of his readership never forgave him. The government, reading the political temperature, moved to lock in its advantages before the tide could turn further. In September 1900, with the war officially declared nearly won and the main Boer capitals captured, Prime Minister Lord Salisbury called a general election. The timing was deliberate. Wave the flag early, before the guerrilla war dragged on, before the camps became common knowledge, before the doubts hardened into votes. The Conservatives and their liberal unionist allies won convincingly. Critics named it the khaki election, a term that carried undisguised contempt, suggesting that the government had wrapped itself in military uniforms and dared voters to disagree. The aftermath was bitter. The Liberals had lost, but they had found something in losing. The war had clarified the party's purpose, forced it to articulate what it believed about empire, conscience, and the limits of power. Campbell Bannerman, once seen as a cautious and perhaps temporary leader, had staked out moral ground that his party would stand on for years to come. Britain had voted for the war, but voting for something and being proud of it are different things. As the guerrilla conflict ground on and the casualty lists lengthened, a slow, uncomfortable reckoning was beginning. The question was no longer simply whether Britain would win, but what kind of country would be left when the winning was done. By the summer of 1901, the pressure had become impossible to ignore. Emily Hobhouse's reports had circulated. Campbell Bannerman's phrase hung in the air. And now, with death tolls climbing and parliamentary questions multiplying, the government faced a choice. It could continue dismissing its critics as sentimental and unpatriotic, or it could be seen to act. It chose to act carefully and on its own terms. The solution was a commission. Not just any commission, but one led by a figure whose credentials could not easily be attacked. Millicent Garrett Fawcett was one of the most respected women in public life, a committed suffragist, and crucially, a supporter of the war itself. If she found nothing seriously wrong with the camps, the government could point to her conclusions and close the debate. If she found problems, her standing as a patriot would blunt the political damage. It was, in its way, a calculated gamble. Fawcett accepted the appointment in July 1901. She and her team of women investigators arrived in South Africa that August, visiting camp after camp across the veldt. What they found was not the product of enemy propaganda or liberal sentiment. It was documented, measured, and damning. The Commission's report confirmed systemic neglect. Rations were inadequate, particularly for children accustomed to a Boer diet heavy in meat rather than the tinned goods being distributed. Medical facilities were overwhelmed and understaffed. Soap was scarce. Clean water was unreliable. In several camps, the mortality among children under 5 had reached levels that Fawcett's team described, with careful understatement, as impossible to justify on any grounds of necessity. The government received the report and did something governments rarely do with uncomfortable findings. It acted on them. Whether from genuine conscience or sheer fear of what continued inaction would mean politically, reforms came quickly. Camp administration was transferred from the military to the civilian colonial office in November 1901. Food supplies were improved and better calibrated to the actual needs of the population. Additional medical staff were recruited and dispatched. Soap and basic sanitation supplies arrived in quantities that had simply not existed before. The results were measurable. The monthly death rate in the camps, which had peaked at catastrophic levels in the autumn of 1901, began falling sharply. By early 1902, it had dropped to a fraction of its worst figures. Lives that would have been lost were saved. But the arithmetic of what had already happened could not be undone. Estimates of total deaths in the camps have been debated by historians for over a century. The most careful scholarship places the figure at somewhere between 22,000 and 28,000 Boer civilians, the overwhelming majority of them children. In the camps for Black Africans, where record-keeping was even less reliable, the toll was at minimum comparable and likely higher. The political awkwardness of official acknowledgement was profound. To admit the reforms had been necessary was to admit the conditions had required them. The government threaded this needle with the practiced delicacy of people who understood exactly what they were doing. Improvements were announced as the natural evolution of a wartime program, not as a response to documented catastrophe. Fawcett herself held to a complicated position. She acknowledged what she had found, pressed hard for the reforms that followed, and never stopped believing the war itself had been justified. Her legacy, like the commission she led, would be contested for generations. The camps were reforming. The war itself was not yet over. And in London and Pretoria both, men were beginning to ask what a negotiated ending might look like, and what price Britain would ultimately pay for the peace it needed. While the British government quietly reformed its camps and politicians carefully managed the language of accountability, something else was happening beyond the borders of the empire. The world had been watching. And what it saw had changed something that could not easily be changed back. Across continental Europe, the reaction was fierce. In France, still nursing its wounds from the Fashoda incident of 1898, newspapers ran cartoons depicting Britannia as a bully crushing small nations beneath her boot. In Germany, the Kaiser had sent a famous telegram congratulating the Boers after Jameson's raid 5 years earlier, and public sympathy had never really shifted. Dutch crowds held rallies for a people they considered kin. In Russia, the war confirmed every suspicion about British hypocrisy, a nation that preached civilization while burning farms and filling camps with the sick and the dying. This sentiment was more than editorial opinion. Young men from across Europe made their way to South Africa to fight for the Boer cause. Irish volunteers arrived, animated by their own grievances against the empire. French and German fighters joined commando units. Scandinavians, Russians, Americans. Perhaps 2,000 foreign volunteers in total, a small number militarily, but an enormous statement symbolically. The Boer republics had become, in the imagination of much of the world, the underdog standing against imperial arrogance. In the United States, the press coverage was substantial and largely unfavorable to Britain. Mark Twain wrote with barely contained fury about the mechanics of imperial conquest. Irish-American communities organized protest meetings in Boston and New York. Even those Americans broadly sympathetic to Anglo-Saxon kinship found themselves uncomfortable with the images emerging from South Africa. The special relationship, such as it was in 1901, absorbed real strain. The damage traveled further still. In India, where Britain governed some 300 million people through a combination of force, administration, and carefully cultivated prestige, educated nationalists read the Boer War coverage with close attention. If the empire would treat white Christian farmers this way, what did it reveal about the true nature of British rule? The war did not cause Indian nationalism, but it provided its advocates with new arguments and sharpened existing ones. Britain found itself diplomatically exposed in ways it had not anticipated at the war's outset. The alliance with Portugal held, as it always had, but overtures toward meaningful European partnership found cold receptions. The policy of splendid isolation, once a posture of strength, now looked rather more like loneliness. What had begun as a punitive campaign to reassert imperial authority had instead broadcast, to every corner of the globe, the costs and contradictions of that authority. The military problem in South Africa was approaching its resolution. The problem of what the world now thought of Britain, and perhaps more troublingly, what some within the empire were beginning to think themselves, was only beginning. By the beginning of 1902, the arithmetic of the war told a story of inevitable British victory. And yet the fighting continued. Those who remained in the field had a name for themselves: bitter enders. The bitter enders. Men who had watched their farms burn, their families disappear into camps, their comrades surrender or die, and who had chosen against all rational calculation to keep fighting. Their numbers had dwindled from the tens of thousands who had taken the field in 1899 to perhaps 16,000 mounted fighters spread across the vast interior. Exhausted, hungry, their horses worn thin, their ammunition running low, they were by any conventional measure a defeated force. And yet they refused to behave like one. Christian de Wet remained their most potent symbol. The Free State general had by this point slipped through British encirclement so many times that his escapes had acquired an almost mythological quality. British columns numbering in the thousands would close around him, and somehow, always, de Wet would find the gap, the night crossing, the unexpected route through terrain his pursuers couldn't navigate quickly enough. He was not winning. He was simply, stubbornly, refusing to lose. The British response to this persistence hardened. When Cape Colony rebels, British subjects who had taken up arms for the Boer cause, were captured, they faced not the treatment accorded prisoners of war, but the charge of treason. Several were executed. Foreign volunteers who had crossed the ocean out of sympathy or adventure faced similar severity. These executions provoked anger and debate, both within Britain and beyond its borders. Were these the actions of a civilized empire administering justice, or something closer to vengeance? Among the Boers themselves, the long resistance was opening wounds that would outlast the war. Between the Bitterenders and the Hensoppers, those who had surrendered and accepted British terms, bitterness ran deep. Some who had surrendered were now riding with British forces as national scouts, helping track their former comrades across familiar country. To the Bitterenders, this was the deepest betrayal imaginable. To those who had surrendered, continued resistance was simply prolonging the suffering of a people who could not win. Both sides were exhausted in ways that went beyond the physical. British soldiers had been in the field for years, rotating through a landscape that offered no clear victory, only the grinding repetition of sweeps, blockhouses, and skirmishes that seemed to resolve nothing. The emotional weight of what the war had become pressed down on everyone caught within it. And yet the Bitterenders held on, because surrender felt to them like the final erasure of everything they had fought for. Their endurance would ultimately force the British to the negotiating table, not as conquerors dictating terms to a prostrate enemy, but as exhausted parties seeking a way out. What came next would determine the shape of South Africa for generations to come. On the last day of May 1902, 60 Boer delegates gathered in a farmhouse near the town of Vereeniging on the banks of the Vaal River. They had ridden in from across the shattered landscape of the republics, Bitterenders and Hensoppers alike, men who had spent years on opposite sides of the bitterest argument their people had ever faced. Now they sat together and they voted on whether their nations would continue to exist. The debate had been agonizing. General Christian de Wet, who had become the very symbol of defiance, argued for continued resistance. He could not bring himself to sign away the independence that men had died defending. Others spoke of the camps, the children still dying, the farms reduced to ash, a people who could not survive another season of war. Jan Smuts, the brilliant young Cape lawyer turned guerrilla commander, made the case for surrender with cold clarity. To fight on was not courage. It was the destruction of the Afrikaner people itself. The final vote was 60 in favor of peace, 6 against. De Wet, in the end, added his signature. The terms Britain offered were, in some respects, generous by the standards of the age. The Boers would surrender their sovereignty and accept the authority of the crown. In return, they would receive amnesty, financial compensation for rebuilding their farms, and a promise that the former republics would eventually receive self-governance. Those last words carried enormous weight. Britain was not simply absorbing a conquered territory. It was promising the Boers that they would one day govern themselves again within the empire's framework. That promise would be honored with remarkable speed. But buried within the treaty's language lay a sentence that would cast a shadow across the following century. The question of political rights for Black South Africans, the question of the franchise, would not be decided until after self-governance had been restored to the former republics. In practice, this meant the question would be decided by the very men who had just surrendered their guns, men whose views on the matter required no extensive investigation. It was not an oversight. It was a choice. British negotiators understood precisely what they were deferring and to whom. The moral arguments that had occasionally surfaced during the war, the voices insisting that African people had stakes in this conflict too, were set aside in the interest of reconciliation between white combatants. The human toll of the war now stood as a monument to that calculation. Approximately 75,000 people had died. The camp deaths, most of them women and children, the Boer fighters killed in the field, and the African men, women, and children who had suffered in their own separate and undercounted camps, all contributed to a reckoning that the peace treaty did nothing to address. A society had been shattered and would now be rebuilt, but rebuilt on terms that excluded the majority of its people from any meaningful say in what it became. The war had cost Britain its moral authority in the eyes of much of the world. The peace would cost something more durable still. The men who signed at Vereeniging walked out into a southern hemisphere autumn, the high-veld air cool and thin. The war was over. But the consequences of how it had been fought and how it had been ended were only beginning. What Britain would make of its hard-won victory in the years that followed would reveal just how much, and how little, the empire had learned from the ordeal it had put an entire people through. The victory had been won. But at what price? When British accountants finally tallied the bill for 3 years of war against two republics, whose combined white population barely exceeded that of a mid-sized English city, the figures were staggering. The conflict had consumed more than £200 million, a sum that dwarfed every military expenditure since the Napoleonic Wars. For that money, Britain had deployed nearly 500,000 soldiers, constructed 8,000 miles of blockhouse lines, and operated the largest network of concentration camps in the empire's history. The arithmetic of imperial hubris had rarely been so nakedly exposed. The human cost was no less sobering. More than 22,000 British soldiers died during the South African campaign, and here the numbers carried their own particular humiliation. Fewer than 6,000 fell to Boer bullets. The rest, nearly 4 in every 5 deaths, were claimed by disease. Typhoid, dysentery, and enteric fever moved through the army's camps with a freedom the Boer commandos could never achieve on the battlefield. Men who had survived ambushes on the Natal Kopjes died in hospital tents from contaminated water. It was a damning verdict on military medicine, military hygiene, and military leadership alike. The war had revealed something else, something that disturbed Whitehall in ways that extended far beyond South Africa. When recruitment offices had opened across Britain's industrial cities in 1901, the men who presented themselves were frequently unfit for service. Malnourished, stunted, afflicted with the accumulated miseries of urban poverty, a shocking proportion of volunteers failed even the Army's modest physical standards. In Manchester, nearly 60% of recruits were rejected outright. The empire that fancied itself the pinnacle of civilization was producing young men who could not carry a rifle across a field. The psychological dimensions of the war were harder to quantify, but no less real. Britain had entered the conflict expecting a brisk colonial tidying up and had instead discovered itself engaged in something that troubled the national conscience for years afterward. Farm burning, the camps, the grinding counterinsurgency that offered neither glory nor clean moral footing. Veterans returned home carrying experiences that did not translate easily into the language of imperial triumph. There were no stirring cavalry charges to celebrate, no single dramatic victory to point toward. There was only the slow, ugly arithmetic of attrition. Military reform followed quickly, driven by men who understood that the next great conflict, if it came, would not forgive the same failures. Richard Haldane reorganized the army with genuine seriousness, creating the British Expeditionary Force and the Territorial Army from the wreckage of Boer War lessons. The machinery was rebuilt. But the moral questions the war had raised proved far less tractable than questions of military organization. For those asking what Britain had truly lost in South Africa, the answer was becoming clearer with every passing year. The peace treaties were signed. The flags were planted. And now came the harder work of turning two conquered republics into something that looked, sounded, and thought like Britain. Lord Alfred Milner arrived in South Africa carrying blueprints for a transformation. As High Commissioner, he envisioned a new dominion, English-speaking, efficient, loyal to the crown, its gold revenues flowing into imperial coffers with the orderly precision of a well-run bank. To build this future, he assembled around him a group of young Oxford graduates, brilliant, idealistic, and almost entirely ignorant of the people they intended to remake. Journalists called them Milner's Kindergarten. The nickname was affectionate. The results were rather less so. The kindergarten threw themselves into reconstruction with genuine energy. Schools were built, railways extended, administrative systems overhauled. The Transvaal and Orange River Colony received the infrastructure of modern governance, mapped, catalogued, and organized according to British templates. What Milner's men could not grasp, or would not, was that the Boers had not been waiting to be improved. The gold mines presented a particular problem. The war had devastated the labor supply, and Milner's solution was characteristically bold and catastrophically misjudged. Between 1904 and 1907, roughly 63,000 Chinese laborers were imported to work the Rand under contracts that critics described, with some precision, as indentured servitude. The liberal opposition in London erupted. Chinese slavery, they called it, and the phrase stuck with the damaging adhesiveness of a good political slogan. It handed the Liberal Party a weapon, and the Conservatives never entirely recovered from the wound. Meanwhile, in the farmhouses and small towns of the former republics, something was hardening. Milner's Anglicization policies, his insistence on English language education, his barely concealed contempt for Afrikaner culture, did not produce the assimilation he sought. They produced the opposite. Poets and dominee preachers and schoolteachers began articulating something that had been felt but never quite named: a people, a language, a destiny. The Dutch Reformed Church became a vessel for collective memory, and the memory it preserved was not of defeat but of martyrdom. The women who had died in the camps, the children, the burned homesteads, these became the founding mythology of a nationalism far more potent than anything the old Boer republics had ever generated. The British government, changing hands with the liberal landslide of 1906, drew its own conclusions. Within 2 years, both the Transvaal and the Orange River Colony received responsible self-government. The speed of the concession astonished many. Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, men who had fought Britain to exhaustion on the veldt, now governed with British blessing. Magnanimity, London called it. Afrikaner nationalists filed the lesson carefully under a different heading. The Union of South Africa came into being on the 31st of May 1910, exactly 8 years after the peace at Vereeniging. 4 colonies merged into one dominion. Botha became its first prime minister. The Union Jack flew from the government buildings in Pretoria. By every formal measure, reconciliation had been achieved. But the settlement that created the Union contained a silence louder than anything spoken aloud. The black African majority, whose land the war had been fought over, whose labor had always been the true prize, received nothing. Their political exclusion was not an oversight. It was the price of white reconciliation, the invisible foundation upon which British and Boer could agree to stand together. Victory, Reconstruction, Union. The story looked tidy from London. From the ground, it was already becoming something else entirely. The Union Jack flew. The speeches were made. And buried inside the South Africa Act of 1909, written by lawyers in London and ratified by a parliament 3 months later, was a sentence that would shape the lives of millions for generations to come. The clause was almost clinical in its brevity. No person of color could sit in the new Union's parliament. The franchise that black Africans held in the Cape Colony, limited as it was, would be frozen, then slowly strangled. The political architecture of the new South Africa was designed explicitly around the exclusion of the majority of its people. This was not incidental. It was the point. Delegations traveled to London to protest. Men like Walter Rubusana and John Tengo Jabavu, educated, articulate, speaking the language of British liberal values back to their supposed champions, arrived in Westminster to argue the case for their communities. They received polite receptions and accomplished nothing. The British government had already decided that white unity in South Africa was worth more than black political rights. The delegations returned home carrying the full weight of that answer. What do you do when every formal avenue has been closed? You build your own. In Bloemfontein on the 8th of January 1912, representatives from across South Africa gathered to found what they called the South African Native National Congress. It would later be renamed the African National Congress. Its founders were ministers, lawyers, journalists, and chiefs. They wore formal dress. They passed resolutions in measured language. They believed, with a faith that seems almost heartbreaking in retrospect, that a reasoned appeal to justice might yet be heard. They were not given long to wait for their answer. The Natives Land Act of 1913 drew a line across the country. Black South Africans, roughly 70% of the population, were legally confined to ownership of roughly 7% of the land. White farmers could no longer have black tenant farmers working their land under traditional sharecropping arrangements. Overnight, families who had farmed the same soil for generations found themselves dispossessed. Their cattle sold, their options reduced to wage labor in white-owned mines and farms. Sol Plaatje, one of the founding members of the new Congress, traveled through the Orange Free State documenting the human catastrophe. He described families wandering through winter frost with nowhere left to go, their eviction perfectly legal under the new law. The line from Vereeniging to this moment was not subtle. At the peace negotiations in 1902, the British had explicitly deferred the question of black political rights until after white self-government was established. They had known what they were doing. Handing that decision to the men who had fought to preserve white supremacy on the veldt guaranteed the outcome. The Land Act was not an accident of 1913. It was the promise of 1902 being kept. Historians would later debate whether apartheid, formally enacted in 1948, represented a rupture in South African history or simply the systematization of what already existed. The evidence points firmly toward the latter. The architecture was already standing. The racial categories were already encoded in law. The exclusions were already absolute. What came after was not a new building, but a renovation of a structure Britain had helped design and then handed over. The ANC would spend the next 8 decades seeking the rights that had been promised and denied. The price paid for white reconciliation was extracted, with compound interest, from those who had never been invited to the negotiating table at all. The war was over. The camps were closed. The dead were buried. But the questions the Boer War had forced into the open refused to be quiet. In 1906, British voters delivered a verdict. The Liberal Party swept into power on the largest parliamentary majority in a generation, carrying with them a current of public exhaustion with imperial adventure. The Conservatives, architects of the war, were routed. It was not quite a referendum on empire, but it carried that weight. Something in the national mood had shifted. Into that moment stepped a man named John Atkinson Hobson. His book, simply titled Imperialism, had appeared in 1902, while the camps were still operating. Hobson argued something that seemed almost seditious at the time, that empire served not the British public but a narrow class of financiers and investors who channeled surplus capital into overseas ventures and wrapped their profits in the language of civilization. The Boer War, to Hobson, was not an aberration. It was the system working exactly as designed. The book traveled. It crossed oceans and found readers who had been looking for exactly this kind of language. Vladimir Lenin read it. Anti-colonial thinkers across Asia and Africa absorbed its framework. A war fought on the South African veldt had produced an intellectual toolkit that would be used to dismantle empires for the next half-century. The military lessons traveled too, though toward darker destinations. The British use of blockhouses, barbed wire, and systematic population displacement had demonstrated that a modern industrial power could suppress a mobile guerrilla force through the control of civilians. Future armies would study those methods and apply them without the uncomfortable press scrutiny that Emily Hobhouse had managed to generate. The concentration camp, as an instrument of counterinsurgency, had found its template. Yet the full weight of that precedent would only become clear across the following decades. The 20th century proved disturbingly fluent in the logic of separating populations, controlling movement, and breaking resistance by targeting those who could not fight back. Britain had not invented that logic, but it had demonstrated its modern application in full view of the world. Decolonization, when it came after 1945, arrived against this accumulated backdrop. Nationalist movements in India, Kenya, Malaya, and across Africa drew on memories, sometimes personal ones, of what empire had actually meant on the ground. The moral authority that Victoria's Britain had claimed so confidently had been spent, piece by piece, on the kopjes and in the camps of South Africa. Britain won the Boer War. It secured the gold fields, unified South Africa under the crown, and wrote the peace on its own terms. What it could not do was escape what that victory had revealed about the nature of the enterprise. Empires rarely end with a single dramatic moment. They unravel slowly, their foundations quietly compromised long before the flags come down. The Boer War was one of those quiet compressions. And the shadow it cast stretched further than anyone in Pretoria, in London, or in the burned farmhouses of the Orange Free State could yet see. What does it mean to win a war and lose something larger in the process? The Boer War offers one of history's clearest answers to that question. Britain emerged from South Africa in 1902 with its objectives achieved and its reputation permanently altered. The distance between those two outcomes became one of the defining measurements of the 20th century. Memory is never neutral. In Britain, the war settled into a complicated silence. There were memorials, regimental honors, and official histories that foregrounded the military campaign and softened everything else. The camps were acknowledged but not examined. Emily Hobhouse, who had done more than any single person to force the truth into public view, was denied passage to South Africa in 1901 when she attempted to return. She spent her later years working for reconciliation, learning Afrikaans, and was ultimately buried in Bloemfontein at the base of the National Women's Monument, the great memorial the Boers built to their own dead. Britain offered her no comparable recognition. The monument itself tells a story. Erected in 1913 by Afrikaner communities, it stands today as one of the most visited historical sites in South Africa. The names carved into its stone represent the 26,000, mainly women and children, who died in the camps. That number had been suppressed, disputed, and minimized during the war itself. In stone, it became permanent. South Africa's own reckoning with that history has never been simple. The Boer War was a war between white colonial populations, conducted across a landscape where Black South Africans were simultaneously casualties and deliberate absences from the official record. Tens of thousands of Black people were also held in concentration camps, their mortality rates equally devastating, their story subsumed for decades beneath the dominant Afrikaner narrative of suffering. The fuller accounting of that history continues. The enduring question the Boer War poses is not really about military strategy or even about guilt. It is about contradiction. Can an empire built on the language of civilization sustain itself once the gap between that language and its actual conduct becomes visible? Britain's administrators believed they were bringing order and progress to the world. The camps made that belief impossible to hold without qualification. Empires survive many things, but they struggle to survive the loss of their own justifying story. The Boer War did not end the British Empire. It lasted another half-century in various forms. But the argument for its existence, the moral confidence that had once seemed unassailable, cracked in the dust of the South African veldt and never fully healed. Emily Hobhouse called what she saw in those camps a wholesale cruelty. She was right, and she said so plainly when plainness was deeply unwelcome. That willingness to witness and to name, against every official pressure to stay quiet, remains her most important legacy and perhaps the Boer War's most enduring lesson. The Boer War's camps and scorched farms didn't just haunt a generation. They exposed the hollow core at the heart of empire, a wound that time and 2 world wars could never fully close. Subscribe for more histories that refuse to look away.